Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the journey of a troubled young scribe named Tobias, a narrative inspired by Psalm 36, one of David's most contemplative meditations on the contrast between wickedness and the boundless love of God. This story explores the transformative power of divine love that reaches to the heavens and the faithfulness that extends to the skies, teaching us about the refuge we find beneath the shadow of God's wings and the satisfaction that comes from drinking from the river of His delights. While you listen, allow these faith-filled words to envelop you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through Scripture-inspired narratives. Now, take a deep breath, settle into the presence of God, and let us begin tonight's journey through this blessed story. The sun had not yet risen over Jerusalem when Tobias awakened on his narrow mat, his heart already heavy with the weight he had carried for weeks. The air in the small room above his father's shop was cool, almost cold, and through the single window, he could see the first hints of purple touching the eastern sky. Somewhere in the darkness below, he heard his father stirring, preparing for morning prayers. The old man's voice, when it came, was steady and sure as he recited the Shema, the same words he had spoken every morning for as long as Tobias could remember. But Tobias remained on his mat, unable to rise, unable to pray, unable to shake the questions that had lodged themselves like thorns in his mind. He was 23 years old, trained since boyhood in the sacred art of copying the Torah, taught to revere every letter as holy, every word as a pathway to understanding the Almighty. His father, Simeon, was known throughout Jerusalem as a scribe of exceptional skill and devotion, a man whose scrolls were sought by synagogues as far away as Damascus. Tobias had learned well. His hand was steady, his letters precise, his knowledge of the law extensive for one so young. Yet, in recent weeks, something had shifted inside him, a darkness that no amount of study or prayer seemed to dispel. The trouble had begun simply enough. While working on a commission for a wealthy Pharisee named Malchus, Tobias had witnessed something that disturbed the foundations of his understanding. Malchus had come to collect the scroll, a beautiful copy of the book of Deuteronomy that had taken Tobias 3 months to complete. The Pharisee had examined it with approval, praising the craftsmanship, running his fingers over the letters with something like affection. Then, as he prepared to leave, a beggar had approached him on the street outside the shop, a man Tobias recognized from the temple courts, known to everyone as Ezra the Blind. The beggar had asked for a single coin, his voice humble, his need evident. Malchus had turned on him with such venom, such contempt, that Tobias had stepped back in shock. The Pharisee had not merely refused the request, but had berated the man, called him worthless, suggested his blindness was divine punishment for some hidden sin, and then swept away with the sacred scroll tucked under his arm, leaving Ezra trembling in the dust. That night, Tobias had been unable to sleep. The image of Malchus clutching the Torah while scorning the beggar had seemed to him a kind of blasphemy, though he could not articulate why. In the days that followed, he began to see more. He saw scribes and teachers who knew the law with perfect accuracy, yet seemed to have no love in their hearts. He saw wealthy men bringing elaborate sacrifices to the temple while their servants went hungry. He saw those who prayed loudly in the synagogues, but whispered cruel gossip in the marketplaces. And slowly, insidiously, a question had formed in his mind, a question he dared not speak aloud. If these learned men, these keepers of the law, could be so heartless, what did that say about the law itself? What did it say about God? The question terrified him because he knew it was wrong, knew it was dangerous, knew it represented a kind of transgression his father would not understand. But once thought, it could not be unthought. It grew in the darkness of his mind like a twisted vine, wrapping around his certainty, choking his faith. He found himself going through the motions of his work, copying words he no longer felt, speaking prayers that seemed to dissolve into empty air. The joy he had once found in the Scriptures had turned to dust. The sense of God's presence he had known since childhood had faded to a distant memory. Now, as the dawn light strengthened and he heard his father climbing the stairs, Tobias forced himself to rise. Simeon appeared in the doorway, his white beard catching the early light, his eyes sharp with concern. The old man saw too much, always had. "You did not join me for prayers," Simeon said quietly. It was not an accusation, merely an observation, but Tobias felt it like a weight. I did not sleep well, Father," Tobias said, which was true enough. Simeon stepped into the room, his movements slow but purposeful. He had been a scribe for more than 40 years, and his back was bent from decades of hunching over parchment. But there was a strength in him that had nothing to do with the body. "What troubles you, my son?" he asked. "For weeks now, I have watched you grow distant, watched the light fade from your eyes. You think I do not notice, but a father sees." Tobias wanted to tell him everything, wanted to pour out the confusion and anger and doubt that had been building inside him, but the words would not come. How could he explain to this righteous man, this devoted servant of God, that he had begun to question everything they both held sacred? How could he say that the faith that sustained his father seemed increasingly like a beautiful lie, a comfort for the simple-minded, contradicted by everything he saw in the world around him? Instead, he said, "I have been thinking about the nature of wickedness, Father, about how those who claim to follow God often seem no different from those who do not." Simeon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying his son's face. Then he moved to the window and looked out over the awakening city, where the first merchants were opening their stalls, and the temple priests were beginning the morning sacrifices. "You have seen something that has shaken you," he said finally. It was not a question. Tobias nodded, though his father's back was turned. "I have seen that knowledge of the law does not guarantee goodness," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have seen cruelty in the hearts of those who should be most righteous, and I find myself wondering if there is any real difference between the wicked and the righteous at all." The words hung in the air between them, and Tobias braced himself for his father's response, expecting anger or disappointment, or perhaps a lecture on the dangers of doubt. But Simeon simply turned from the window and looked at his son with an expression of profound sadness, mixed with something that might have been understanding. "When I was your age," the old man said slowly, "I struggled with similar questions. I saw the same hypocrisy, the same hardness of heart among those who claimed to serve God. And I too wondered if faith was merely a mask that people wore to hide their true nature." Tobias looked up in surprise. He had never heard his father speak this way. Simeon came and sat on the edge of the mat, his old bones creaking. "What changed?" Tobias asked. His father smiled, a gentle expression that transformed his weathered face. "I went on a journey," he said, "a long journey that taught me to see beyond the failures of men to the faithfulness of God. The wickedness you have witnessed, my son, is real. It exists. King David himself wrote of it in his Psalms, how transgression speaks to the wicked in the depths of their hearts, how there is no fear of God before their eyes. But that is only half the truth. There is another reality, deeper and more true, and you cannot see it while you remain here, surrounded by the noise and corruption of the city." "What do you mean?" Tobias asked, something stirring in his chest, a flicker of the curiosity that had once driven his study of Scripture. Simeon stood and moved to a small chest in the corner of the room. He opened it and withdrew a worn leather pouch, which he handed to his son. "There is a place," he said, "in the wilderness east of the Jordan, where I once spent 40 days in solitude and prayer. It is a place where the distractions of human wickedness fade away, where you can see clearly what is most real. I think you need to go there, Tobias. I think you need to undertake the journey I once made." Tobias opened the pouch and found it contained coins, enough for travel and provisions. "But, Father, the work, the commissions we have promised." Simeon waved his hand dismissively. "I managed this shop before you were born, and I can manage it again. The work will wait. Your soul cannot." He placed his hand on Tobias's shoulder, and the gesture contained such warmth, such paternal love, that Tobias felt his throat tighten. "Go, my son. Go and see what I once saw. Go and learn what cannot be taught in words. When you return, you will understand." And so it was that as the sun cleared the eastern wall of the city, Tobias found himself walking through the Damascus gate with a small pack on his back, a staff in his hand, and a heart full of questions. The pouch of coins was tied to his belt, along with a water skin and a small loaf of bread his father had pressed into his hands at the door. The streets were already filling with people, merchants calling their wares, children running between the stalls, priests moving in solemn procession toward the temple. It was the Jerusalem he had known all his life, vibrant and alive and endlessly complicated. But this morning he felt detached from it all, as if he were already gone, already in that wilderness his father had described. He passed through the outer precincts of the city, where the houses grew more sparse and the streets less crowded. Here lived the poorer families, those who could not afford homes closer to the center. And Tobias saw scenes that reinforced his troubled thoughts. An old woman begging at a corner, ignored by everyone who passed. A child with a twisted leg, sitting alone against a wall. A family huddled in the doorway of an abandoned building, their clothes ragged, their faces hollow with hunger. Where was God's love for them? Where was his unfailing care? The questions pulsed in his mind with each step he took. As the sun climbed higher, Tobias left the last houses behind and began the descent into the Kidron Valley. The path was well worn, used by countless pilgrims and travelers over the centuries. On his left rose the Mount of Olives, covered with ancient trees, their silver-green leaves rustling in the morning breeze. On his right, the wall of the city gleamed white in the sunlight, and he could see the golden roof of the temple rising above everything, a monument to God's glory and man's devotion. Or was it a monument to man's vanity? He pushed the thought away, but it lingered like smoke. The valley floor was cool and shadowed, and Tobias stopped at a small spring to refill his water skin. The water was clear and cold, tasting of stone and earth. He drank deeply, feeling it spread through his body, and for a moment the simplicity of the act brought him a measure of peace. Water was honest. Water made no claims or pretensions. It simply was what it was, and it sustained life without judgment or favoritism. He found himself envying its simplicity. From the valley, the path began to climb again, winding up the eastern slope toward the wilderness beyond. This was the direction Jesus the Nazarene was said to have gone when he sought solitude, though Tobias knew little of that wandering rabbi except rumors and fragments of teaching that had reached Jerusalem. Some said he was a prophet. Others called him a blasphemer. Tobias had no opinion on the matter. Right now, all prophets and teachers seemed equally suspect, equally capable of profound wisdom and profound hypocrisy. By midday, he had reached the crest of the ridge, and the wilderness spread before him like a vast sea of stone and sand. The change was stark and immediate. Behind him lay the green slopes of the Mount of Olives, the orchards and vineyards, the cultivated terraces where farmers coaxed life from the earth. Before him lay desolation, a landscape of bare rock and dry wadis, stretching east toward the Jordan and beyond. The sun beat down with relentless intensity, and the air shimmered with heat. There were no sounds, except the whisper of wind over stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Tobias stood for a long time on that ridge, feeling the weight of his decision. To continue meant to leave behind everything familiar, to trust that this journey into emptiness would somehow answer the questions that tormented him. To turn back meant to return to his comfortable life in Jerusalem, to his work and his father's house, carrying his doubt like a hidden wound. The choice should have been simple, but it was not. Part of him wanted desperately to turn back, to forget this foolishness and lose himself in the rhythms of daily life. But a deeper part, the part that still hungered for truth despite his disillusionment, urged him forward. He took a step, then another, and soon he was descending into the wilderness, following a narrow path that wound between boulders and stunted thorn bushes. The temperature rose with each downward step, and by the time he reached the floor of the first wadi, his tunic was soaked with sweat. He found a small patch of shade beneath an overhanging rock and rested there, eating a portion of his bread and drinking sparingly from his water skin. The silence was profound, almost oppressive. In Jerusalem, there was always noise, voices, footsteps, the braying of donkeys, the calls of vendors, the endless hum of human activity. Here, there was nothing. The wilderness swallowed sound and offered nothing in return. As the afternoon wore on, Tobias continued his journey, following the wadi eastward. He passed no one. The wilderness in summer was avoided by all but the most desperate or determined. Occasionally, he saw signs of life, the track of a fox in the dust, the dried droppings of a wild goat, the skeleton of some small animal bleached white by the sun. But mostly, there was only stone and silence. His thoughts, which had been so turbulent in Jerusalem, began to slow and settle. There was something about the emptiness that demanded a kind of internal quiet. The constant chatter of his mind, the endless analysis and questioning, seemed absurd in this place where nothing grew and nothing changed. By evening, he had traveled perhaps 10 miles from Jerusalem, though it felt like 10,000. The city and all its complications seemed impossibly distant, as if they belonged to another world entirely. He found a small cave in the side of the wadi, barely large enough to sit upright, and decided to spend the night there. He gathered a few pieces of dried dung left by some animal and built a small fire at the cave's entrance. The flames were cheerful company as darkness fell, and he sat watching them dance, feeling the desert chill settle over the land. He tried to pray, as was his custom, but the words felt hollow and mechanical. He recited the evening Shema by rote, his voice sounding strange in the vastness of the desert night. When he finished, he sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire. Above him, the stars were emerging, more stars than he had ever seen in the light-polluted sky above Jerusalem. They filled the heavens from horizon to horizon, a multitude beyond counting, each one sharp and clear and impossibly distant. He found himself staring at them for a long time, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, a thought formed in his mind. These stars had been here long before Jerusalem existed, before the temple was built, before the Torah was given, before Abraham had left Ur. They would be here long after everything he knew had crumbled to dust. They kept their courses without reference to human affairs, unconcerned with the wickedness of men or the struggles of faith. They were vast and eternal and indifferent. And yet, according to everything he had been taught, they were not random or meaningless. They were placed by God, hung in the heavens as signs and markers, evidence of a wisdom and power beyond human comprehension. David had written that the heavens declared the glory of God, that the skies proclaimed the work of his hands. Tobias looked at them now and wondered if that could possibly be true, or if it was just another beautiful lie humans told themselves to make sense of an indifferent universe. He slept fitfully that night, waking often to add fuel to the fire. When dawn came, it arrived slowly, the eastern sky passing through shades of deep blue to violet to pale gold. Tobias emerged from the cave stiff and sore, his body unaccustomed to sleeping on bare rock. He ate the last of his bread and drank from his water skin, which was now less than half full. According to his father's instructions, there was a spring about a day's journey ahead, near the ruins of an ancient monastery where hermits had once lived. He needed to reach it before his water ran out. The second day of walking was harder than the first. The newness had worn off, and he was left with only the grinding reality of heat and thirst and aching muscles. The landscape became even more barren, if that were possible. He was descending now toward the Jordan Valley, following ancient paths marked by cairns of piled stones. The sun seemed to press down on him with physical force, and his shadow became his only companion, shortening at midday and lengthening again in the afternoon. It was in the heat of midday, when he was at his most exhausted and dispirited, that he saw another traveler. At first, it was just a dark shape shimmering in the distance, and he thought it might be a mirage or a rock formation. But as he continued walking, the shape resolved into a human figure, moving slowly along the same path from the opposite direction. Tobias felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Company would be welcome, but in the wilderness, one could never be entirely sure of a stranger's intentions. As they drew closer, Tobias saw that the traveler was an old man, far older than his father, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that seemed to have faded from their original color to something closer to gray or silver. He wore a simple robe that might once have been white, but was now the same dun color as the desert around them. A staff supported his steps, and a small pack was slung over one shoulder. When they met, the old man smiled, revealing gaps where several teeth had once been, and raised his hand in greeting. "Peace be upon you, young traveler," he said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his apparent age. "You are far from anywhere this day." Tobias returned the greeting, feeling suddenly awkward, his city manners out of place in this stark setting. "I am traveling to the ruins of the hermitage, near the spring," he said. "My father told me of it." The old man nodded. Ah, yes, the spring of Einkelt. I know it well. I have just come from there myself. The water is sweet and cold, thanks be to God. You have perhaps another 2 hours of walking ahead of you. They stood together in the narrow shade of a rock outcropping, and the old man offered Tobias a drink from his own water skin, which Tobias accepted gratefully. The water was indeed sweet, better than any he had tasted. You have been to the hermitage? Tobias asked. The old man smiled again. I have lived there off and on for more years than I care to count. I am one of the hermits, I suppose, though most of my brothers have died or returned to their families. I am Matthias, last of a dwindling company. Tobias introduced himself and explained, somewhat haltingly, that he had come seeking, he was not sure what exactly. Clarity, perhaps, understanding. Matthias listened with the kind of attention that suggested he heard more than was being said. When Tobias finished, the old man was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. You are troubled by wickedness, he said finally. It was not a question. Tobias nodded. I am troubled by the gap between what people profess and what they do. I am troubled by the cruelty of those who claim to serve God. I am troubled by my own doubts. Matthias leaned heavily on his staff, and Tobias noticed that his hands, gnarled and spotted with age, trembled slightly. These are ancient troubles, the hermit said. King David himself wrote of them. Do you know the 36th Psalm? Tobias did, of course. He had copied it more than once. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in their hearts, he recited from memory. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Matthias nodded approvingly. Yes, exactly so. David saw what you have seen. He understood that there are those who flatter themselves, believing that their wickedness will not be discovered or hated. They speak words that are mischief and deceit. They have ceased to act wisely or do good. Even on their beds, they plot mischief. They set themselves on a path that is not good and do not reject evil. Then you understand why I am troubled, Tobias said. If this is the nature of humanity, if even those who claim righteousness are capable of such evil, what hope is there? The old man's eyes sharpened, and he looked at Tobias with an intensity that seemed incongruous with his frail body. But that is only the first part of the psalm, young scribe. Have you forgotten what follows? David does not end with wickedness. He moves from the observation of human failure to the contemplation of divine faithfulness. Your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens. Your faithfulness extends to the skies. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your justice is like the great deep. The words struck Tobias with unexpected force, perhaps because they were spoken here in the wilderness, with the immensity of the sky overhead and the ancient mountains visible in the distance. In Jerusalem, in his small room above the shop, they had been merely words on parchment, beautiful but abstract. Here, they seemed to point to something real, something vast and enduring that had nothing to do with the pettiness of human behavior. Come, Matthias said, touching Tobias's arm with surprising gentleness. I am traveling north toward Jericho, but I will walk with you a little way toward the spring. There are things I would say to you, and the desert is a good place for speaking truth. They walked together slowly, adjusting their pace to the old man's careful steps. For a time, neither spoke, and Tobias found the silence companionable rather than oppressive. Eventually, Matthias began to speak, his voice falling into a rhythm that reminded Tobias of prayer or recitation. When I was young, the hermit said, younger even than you, I too saw the wickedness of men and despaired. I was a Pharisee, trained in the law, zealous for righteousness. I believed that if only everyone would follow the commandments perfectly, We would create a holy society, a kingdom worthy of God's blessing. But the more I studied and taught, the more I saw that knowledge of the law did not transform the heart. I saw my fellow teachers use their learning as a weapon to humiliate the ignorant. I saw them lay heavy burdens on the poor while exempting themselves. I saw them honor God with their lips while their hearts were far from Him. Tobias listened intently, recognizing his own experience in the old man's words. "What did you do?" he asked. Matthias smiled, a sad expression. "I became bitter. I railed against hypocrisy. I denounced my fellow teachers. I became self-righteous in my opposition to self-righteousness. I was insufferable, I think, though I believed I was doing God's work. And then one day, a wise woman, she was my mother, in fact, said something that changed everything. She said, 'Matthias, you have become so focused on the darkness that you can no longer see the light.' They reached the edge of a steep descent, and Matthias paused to catch his breath. Below them, the wadi dropped sharply, and Tobias could see the floor far below, a ribbon of lighter sand winding between dark walls. "I did not understand her at first," the hermit continued. "I thought she was telling me to ignore wickedness, to pretend it did not exist. But that was not her meaning. She was telling me that there are two realities, two truths that coexist. Yes, there is wickedness. Yes, there is hypocrisy and cruelty and faithlessness. This is the reality of human sin, and it is as real as the stones beneath our feet. But there is another reality, deeper and more fundamental. There is the reality of God's love, God's faithfulness, God's righteousness. And if we focus only on the first reality, we miss the second entirely." Tobias felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and disappointment he had been carrying. "But how do we see the second reality?" he asked, "when the first is so present and obvious?" Matthias began the careful descent, placing his staff with care on each step. "By going to places where human wickedness fades into insignificance," he said, "by contemplating the vastness of creation, by sitting in silence until the noise of human affairs grows quiet, by opening ourselves to the possibility that we have been looking at only half the picture." He paused and turned to look back at Tobias. "That is why you are here, is it not? That is why your father sent you into the wilderness, not to escape wickedness, that is impossible, but to see beyond it." They walked on in silence, and Tobias pondered the old man's words. He thought about the stars he had seen the previous night, the way they had seemed to dwarf all human concerns. He thought about the mountains in the distance, standing unchanged, while empires rose and fell. He thought about the wilderness itself, this vast emptiness that cared nothing for human virtue or vice, but simply existed, enduring and patient. Perhaps his father and this old hermit were right. Perhaps his vision had become too narrow, too focused on human failure. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they reached a place where the path divided. Matthias pointed with his staff toward the southern fork. "Follow that way," he said. "In less than an hour, you will see the ruins of the hermitage. The spring is there, and the water is abundant. Stay as long as you need. Pray, listen, wait. God's love reaches to the heavens, young Tobias. But sometimes we must go to quiet places to perceive it." Tobias thanked the old man, feeling a surprising reluctance to see him go. In just a few hours, Matthias had become a kind of anchor, a human connection in the vast emptiness. But the hermit was already moving away, following the northern path with his slow, careful steps. He raised his hand in blessing, and then he was gone, disappearing around a bend in the wadi. Tobias continued alone, And as Matthias had promised, the ruins soon came into view. They sat at the base of a cliff, partially carved from the living rock and partially built with stones quarried from the surrounding desert. Most of the structures had collapsed, their walls reduced to knee-high remnants, but one cave remained intact, its entrance framed by carved pillars that must have been ancient even in Matthias's youth. And beside the cave, water bubbled from the rock face, forming a small pool before trickling away into the sand. The sight of it, after 2 days in the desert, was almost overwhelming. Tobias approached the spring reverently, as if it were a holy place, and in a sense it was. Water in the desert was always sacred, always a gift. He knelt at the pool's edge and drank deeply, the cold water shocking his throat and belly. He drank until he could hold no more, then splashed water over his face and head, feeling the dust and grime of travel wash away. The relief was physical and profound, and for the first time since leaving Jerusalem, he felt something like joy. He explored the ruins as the light faded, finding evidence of the hermits who had once lived here. There were niches carved into the rock where lamps had been placed, their ceilings still blackened with soot. There were shallow depressions where hermits had knelt in prayer, worn smooth by decades or centuries of use. In one corner of the main cave, he found a small cross carved into the stone, and he realized that some of the hermits must have been followers of the Nazarene. The thought disturbed him briefly, but then he let it go. Here, in this place of profound solitude, sectarian divisions seemed petty and meaningless. As night fell, Tobias built a fire at the entrance to the cave using dried brush he found nearby. The flames cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls, and he sat watching them, feeling the deep exhaustion of 2 days' travel settle into his bones. He had brought no food beyond the bread he had already eaten, but he found he was not hungry. The water had satisfied him completely, and there was something else, some feeling he could not quite name, that made physical hunger seem unimportant. He tried again to pray, and this time the words came more easily. He did not recite the formal prayers, but simply spoke, his voice quiet in the immensity of the night. He spoke of his doubts and fears, his anger at hypocrisy, his confusion about faith. He spoke of the wickedness he had witnessed and his struggle to understand how it could coexist with belief in a loving God. And as he spoke, something unexpected happened. He began to cry, not with the bitter tears of frustration, but with tears of release, as if something that had been dammed up inside him was finally breaking free. When the tears stopped, he felt empty but clean, hollowed out and ready to be filled. He lay down by the fire, wrapping himself in his cloak, and looked up at the stars through the cave entrance. They were there again, infinite and eternal, each one a point of light in the darkness. And this time, when he looked at them, he did not see indifference. He saw constancy. He saw faithfulness. He saw something that had endured since the beginning of time and would endure until its end, unchanging and reliable in a way that human virtue could never be. Your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens, he whispered into the darkness. Your faithfulness extends to the skies. The words were from Psalm 36, and they seemed to resonate in the cave, echoing softly off the stone wall. He spoke them again, slower this time, tasting each word. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your justice is like the great deep. He turned his head and could see, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, the dark mass of the mountains to the west. They had been there long before he was born and would remain long after he died. Their righteousness, their uprightness, their refusal to be moved was a kind of sermon, a testimony to something solid and unchanging beneath the chaos of human affairs. Sleep came gradually, and with it, strange dreams. He dreamed he was swimming in the pool beside the cave, but the water was infinitely deep, deeper than the ocean, deeper than the foundations of the mountains. He swam down and down, expecting at any moment to reach the bottom, but there was no bottom. The water was perfectly clear, and he could see in all directions, and everywhere he looked there was only more water, extending in all directions without end. But he was not afraid. The water was warm and gentle, and he knew somehow that he could breathe it, that it was sustaining him even as he descended into its depths. And then a voice spoke, though he could not tell if it came from outside or inside him. And it said, "How precious is your unfailing love, O God! People take refuge in the shadow of your wings." He woke with a start, the dream vivid and immediate. The fire had burned down to coals, and the eastern sky was showing the first gray light of dawn. He lay still for a moment, his heart beating quickly, the words from the dream still echoing in his mind. Shadow of your wings. He knew the phrase from Psalm 36, of course, but he had never really thought about what it meant. Now, lying in this cave carved from living rock, he understood it with sudden clarity. The shadow of wings was not darkness, but protection. It was the shelter a mother bird provided to her chicks, keeping them safe from sun and rain and predator. It was refuge. It was home. Tobias rose and went to the spring, where he washed and drank. The water was even colder in the pre-dawn chill, and it seemed to wash away the last remnants of sleep. He sat at the pool's edge and watched the sunrise, one of the most spectacular he had ever witnessed. The sun emerged from behind the eastern mountains like a living thing, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold and amber. The light fell on the cliff face above the spring, and Tobias saw for the first time that someone, one of the ancient hermits perhaps, had carved words into the stone. He stood and moved closer, squinting to read the Hebrew letters. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from your river of delights. More words from Psalm 36. Whoever had lived here, whoever had carved these words, had understood something that Tobias was only beginning to grasp. The abundance was not material wealth or comfort or even the absence of suffering. The abundance was this: water in the desert, light after darkness, the constancy of the stars, the endurance of mountains. The abundance was the very fact of existence itself, the gift of being alive in a universe held together by something deeper than human goodness or wickedness. He spent the entire day at the spring, and it was one of the most extraordinary days of his life, though nothing dramatic happened. He simply sat, mostly in silence, occasionally moving to different spots around the ruins. He watched the play of light and shadow on the rocks. He observed a small bird that came to drink at the spring, its movements quick and purposeful. He noticed how the wind created patterns in the sand, swirling and settling, ephemeral and beautiful. He watched the progression of shadows across the canyon walls as the sun moved through its ancient arc. Each observation, each moment of simple presence, felt like a form of prayer more authentic than any words he had spoken in the synagogue. By midday, the heat had become intense, and Tobias retreated to the cave. He lay on the cool stone floor and closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. Instead, his mind turned over the words Matthias had spoken and the words carved into the rock face. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from your river of delights. What did it mean to feast on abundance in a place where there was nothing but rock and water? What was this river of delights in the midst of desolation? As he pondered these questions, A memory rose unbidden from his childhood. He must have been 8 or 9 years old, and his father had taken him to the pool of Siloam during the Feast of Tabernacles. The city had been crowded with pilgrims, the air filled with the sounds of celebration and worship. They had waited in line for hours to reach the pool, and Tobias had grown tired and irritable, complaining about his aching feet and his hunger. But when they finally reached the water, when he had bent down and cupped the clear water in his hands and brought it to his lips, something had shifted inside him. The water had tasted ordinary enough, but in that moment, drinking from that ancient pool with thousands of pilgrims around him, all seeking the same blessing, he had felt connected to something vast and timeless. He had felt, without having words for it, that he was part of a story much larger than himself. Lying now in the hermit's cave, Tobias realized that he had lost that feeling somewhere along the way. He had become so focused on the failures of individual people, so consumed by the gap between profession and practice, that he had forgotten the larger story. The story was not about whether Malchus the Pharisee was a hypocrite. The story was about a God who had called a people out of slavery, who had sustained them in the wilderness, who had given them a law not to burden them, but to show them how to live, who had promised to remain faithful even when they were faithless. The story was written in these very rocks, in the springs that bubbled up in impossible places, in the stars that wheeled overhead with perfect regularity, in the dawn that came each morning regardless of human virtue or vice. He sat up slowly and moved to the mouth of the cave. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and the light had taken on a golden quality that transformed the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Tobias pulled from his pack a small scroll he had brought with him, one he had copied himself years ago. It was Psalm 36, the very psalm his father and Matthias had referenced. He unrolled it carefully and read it again, but this time he read it not as a scribe analyzing text, but as a man desperate for truth. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in their hearts. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Yes, he had seen this. He knew it was true. For they flatter themselves in their own eyes that their iniquity cannot be discovered and hated. He had seen this too. Men who knew the law perfectly but used it as a weapon rather than a guide. Men who believed themselves righteous while crushing the weak. This was the reality of human wickedness, and David had seen it just as clearly 3,000 years ago. But then the psalm shifted, and Tobias read the words with new attention. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. He looked up from the scroll to the mountains visible in the distance, their peaks still touched by sunlight, while the valleys below had fallen into shadow, like the mountains of God, unchanging, immovable. There before human wickedness existed, and there after it would be forgotten. He continued reading, You save both man and beast, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. The image struck him with fresh power. Wings! In the wilderness, wings meant birds, hawks and eagles that circled high above, their shadows passing over the ground below. But wings also meant protection, the way a mother bird sheltered her young beneath her feathers, creating a space of safety in a dangerous world. Was it possible that God's love was like that? Not a love that prevented all suffering or erased all wickedness, but a love that provided refuge, a shelter in the midst of the storm. They feast on the abundance of your house. He read on, his voice now speaking the words aloud to the empty desert. You give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light, a fountain of life. Here, at this spring in the wilderness, water bubbled up from deep beneath the earth, sustaining life in a place that should have been lifeless. It came from some hidden source, some reservoir far below that never ran dry. Was that what God's love was like? Not a love that depended on human worthiness or human behavior, but a love that sprang from God's own nature, inexhaustible and freely given. The sun was touching the western mountains now, and the sky had begun its evening transformation. Tobias rolled up the scroll carefully and set it aside. He felt something loosening inside him, some tightly wound knot of anger and disappointment beginning to unravel. He had been asking the wrong question. He had been asking, if people who claim to follow God can be so wicked, what does that say about God? But that was backward. The wickedness of people said nothing about God. It said something about people. The question should have been, if God remains faithful despite human faithlessness, what does that reveal about his nature? He stood and walked to the spring, kneeling again at its edge. The water was perfectly clear, and he could see small stones at the bottom of the pool, smoothed by centuries of water flowing over them. He cupped water in his hands and drank, and this time he paid attention to the act itself. The water was cold and sweet. It required nothing of him except to receive it. He did not have to earn it or prove himself worthy of it. It was simply there, freely available, a gift, and not just to him, to any traveler who passed this way, to the righteous and the wicked alike, to those who believed and those who doubted. The spring did not discriminate, it simply gave. Was this what the psalm meant by God's steadfast love? A love that was not contingent on human merit, but flowed from God's own nature as water flowed from this hidden source. A love that was there whether humans recognized it or not, whether they responded to it or rejected it. Tobias felt tears begin to fall, mixing with the water still dripping from his hands. He had been so focused on human failure that he had become blind to divine faithfulness. He had been staring at the darkness and wondering where the light had gone, never thinking to turn around and look toward the sun. The tears came more freely now, and he let them fall. They were not tears of despair, but of release, the breaking of a dam that had been holding back a flood. He wept for his own blindness, for the months he had spent in bitterness and doubt. He wept for Malchus the Pharisee and men like him, trapped in their own self-righteousness, unable to see the love of God right in front of them. He wept for Ezra the blind and all the suffering people he had seen, and for the mystery of why God allowed such suffering to exist. But underneath the weeping was something else, something he could not quite name yet. It felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. It felt like hope. He remained at the spring until the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. When he finally returned to the cave, he felt exhausted, but clean, emptied, but ready to be filled. He built no fire that night. He simply lay on the stone floor, wrapped in his cloak, and watched the stars through the cave entrance, the same stars that had shone on Abraham and Moses and David, the same stars that would shine long after he was dust. And for the first time in months, their constancy did not seem like indifference. It seemed like faithfulness. Sleep came easily that night, and with it, dreams. He dreamed he was standing at the base of a great mountain, so tall its peak disappeared into the clouds. He knew somehow that he needed to climb it, but when he looked at the steep slopes and jagged rocks, he felt overwhelmed by the impossibility of the task. Then he heard a voice, though he could not tell if it came from outside or inside him, saying, You do not climb alone." And when he looked, he saw that the mountainside was covered with other climbers, some ahead of him, some behind, some struggling, some resting, some helping others. And he understood that the journey was not meant to be made in isolation, but in community, each person supporting the others, all of them heading toward the same peak, even when they could not see it. He woke before dawn, feeling more rested than he had in months. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, that deep blue that comes before the first hint of gold. He rose and went to the spring, where he washed his face and hands and drank deeply. The water seemed even sweeter this morning, or perhaps he was simply more grateful for it. He sat at the pool's edge and watched the dawn unfold, the slow transformation of darkness into light that happened every single day without fail, regardless of human awareness or appreciation. As the sun cleared the eastern mountains, Tobias made a decision. He would stay here at the hermitage for several more days, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. There was more to learn, more to understand, more to integrate. The anger and doubt that had driven him into the wilderness had begun to dissolve, but in their place was a new question, one that felt more hopeful. If God's love is really like this, constant, abundant, freely given, then how should I live in response to it? The second day at the spring followed a rhythm that felt ancient and natural. Tobias woke with the sun, drank from the spring, ate sparingly from the small amount of food he had brought with him, some dried figs and nuts that Matthias had shared before they parted. Then he spent the morning in silence, sometimes sitting in the cave, sometimes walking slowly around the ruins, sometimes simply standing and observing. There was no agenda, no goal except to be present, to notice, to listen. In the middle of the morning, he heard voices approaching and saw 3 figures making their way down the wadi toward the spring. They were travelers like himself, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in the simple clothing of common people. When they reached the spring, they greeted Tobias with surprised pleasure, clearly not expecting to find anyone in such a remote place. They exchanged names and brief histories. The men were brothers, fishermen from the Sea of Galilee, traveling to Jerusalem for a family wedding. The woman was their sister, recently widowed, making the journey to visit her husband's family. They filled their water skins and rested in the shade, and a conversation began naturally, the way conversations do among travelers. The brothers spoke of their work, the challenges of fishing in a lake that could turn violent without warning, the satisfaction of a good catch, the frustration of empty nets. The sister spoke more quietly, and Tobias could hear the grief still fresh in her voice. Her husband had died suddenly, struck down by a fever that came and went in 3 days. She had been left with 2 young children and no way to support them. "But God is faithful," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a simple conviction that moved Tobias deeply. "My husband's brother has taken us into his household. The children will be cared for. It is not the life I imagined, but it is life. God has not abandoned us." Tobias found himself telling them about his own journey, though he was careful with his words. He spoke of his work as a scribe, of his struggle with doubt, of his father's wisdom in sending him into the wilderness. The older brother, whose name was Simon, listened with keen attention. When Tobias finished, Simon nodded slowly. "I have never been much for learning," he said, "never had the opportunity to study the Torah the way scribes do. But the lake has taught me things that I think might be similar to what you're discovering here. The lake does not care if I am righteous or wicked. It gives its fish to whoever lowers a net. Sometimes I fish all night and catch nothing. Sometimes I am barely awake and the net fills until it nearly breaks. There is a randomness to it that used to trouble me. I would pray for a good catch and get nothing. I would forget to pray and haul in abundance. He paused and took a drink from his water skin. But over the years, I have come to understand something. God's provision is not a reward for righteousness. It is a gift that comes from His nature, not our merit. The lake gives because that is what lakes do. They are full of fish. God gives because that is who He is, the source of all abundance. Our job is not to earn the gift, but to receive it with gratitude and share it with others. The word struck Tobias with the force of revelation. This simple fisherman, who could probably not read the Torah, had understood something that had eluded all the learned teachers Tobias had known. God's love was not transactional. It was not a wage earned by obedience or a reward for righteousness. It was the fundamental nature of reality. Like water in a spring or fish in a lake, it flowed freely, and the only question was whether one would open oneself to receive it. The travelers rested for several hours, sharing food and conversation before continuing their journey toward Jerusalem. As they prepared to leave, the widowed sister approached Tobias. She reached into her small bag and pulled out a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. "Please take this," she said. "It is not much, but you have been kind to share your water and your wisdom with us." Tobias tried to refuse. She had so little, and he had his own provisions. But she insisted with such gentle firmness that he finally accepted. As she pressed the bread into his hands, she said something that would stay with him forever. "My husband used to say that when we share what little we have, we discover that God has already given us more than enough." I think he was right. After they left, Tobias sat alone at the spring, holding the bread the widow had given him. It was coarse barley bread, the food of the poor, probably made from the last of her flour. Yet she had given it freely, trusting that somehow there would be more. He unwrapped it slowly and broke off a small piece, putting it in his mouth. It was dry and plain without oil or seasoning, but it tasted to him like the finest feast. This was what the psalm meant by feasting on the abundance of God's house. Not material wealth or luxury, but the richness that came from trust, from generosity, from the recognition that everything was gift. The afternoon passed in contemplation. Tobias found himself thinking about all the moments in his life when he had experienced God's provision without recognizing it as such. The steady love of his father, who had taught him his trade with patience and pride. The beauty of the scriptures he copied, even when he did not fully understand their meaning. The city of Jerusalem itself, with all its complications and contradictions, still a place where people came from across the world to worship. The very fact that he could walk into the wilderness and find water here, in this impossible place, sustaining life where there should have been only death. He thought, too, about wickedness, the thing that had so troubled him. It was real, certainly. Malchus's cruelty to the beggar was real. The hypocrisy of teachers who knew the law but did not live it was real. The suffering of the poor and the vulnerable was real. But he was beginning to understand that these things, as real as they were, existed within a larger context. They were like shadows, real enough, but dependent on the light for their very existence. Wickedness was the absence of love, the turning away from God's abundance. It had no independent existence. It was a negation, not a creation. And if that was true, then the proper response to wickedness was not despair or cynicism. The proper response was to turn toward the light, to align oneself with the source of abundance, to become a conduit rather than a barrier. The wicked might refuse God's love, but that did not diminish the love itself. It simply meant they lived in self-imposed poverty while surrounded by riches they could not see. As the sun began its descent once more, Tobias walked to a high point among the ruins where he could see for miles in every direction. To the west, the mountains of Judah rose in ranges, their slopes golden in the evening light. To the east, the desert stretched toward the Jordan Valley and beyond, a landscape of stunning barrenness. Behind him, the spring continued its patient work, bubbling up from the depths, offering its gift to any who would receive it. And above him, the sky was beginning its nightly transformation, the blue deepening toward purple, the first stars appearing like small promises of the brilliance to come. He stood there for a long time, and gradually words began to form in his mind, not words he had read in any scroll, but words that seemed to rise from his own experience, shaped by everything he had seen and felt over these days in the wilderness. They were his own prayer, his own psalm, an answer to the questions that had driven him from Jerusalem. "I have walked in darkness," he whispered, "and believed the darkness was all there was. I have seen wickedness and called it the whole truth. I have measured your love by human standards and found it wanting. Forgive me, O God, for my blindness. Open my eyes to see what has always been before me. Your love is not like our love, conditional and fragile. Your love is like these mountains, solid, enduring, unchanging. Your faithfulness is like the stars, constant, reliable, shining even when clouds hide them from our sight. Your mercy is like this spring, flowing from depths I cannot fathom, offered freely to all who will drink. Teach me to live in the light of this truth. Teach me to be a channel of your abundance, not a judge of those who refuse it. Teach me to trust in your goodness even when I cannot understand your ways, for I am beginning to see that your love reaches further than the heavens, deeper than the great deep, and nothing, not human wickedness, not my own doubt, not suffering or injustice or death itself can separate us from it." The words came haltingly at first, then more fluidly, pouring out of him like water from the spring. When he finished, he felt lighter, as if he had been carrying a great weight and had finally set it down. The sky was darkening rapidly now, and he made his way back to the cave, where he built a small fire and sat watching its flames dance against the ancient walls. That night, Tobias opened the scroll of Psalm 36 again and read it one more time, but now it was no longer merely text. It was lived experience, truth he had tasted and touched and known in his bones. When he came to the final verses, he read them aloud, his voice steady and sure. "O continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. There the evildoers lie fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise." He understood now that the psalm was not predicting the immediate defeat of the wicked. It was asserting a deeper truth, that wickedness, by its very nature, was a falling, a descent away from the source of life. Those who chose it had already fallen, were already separated from the abundance they so desperately sought through their grasping and manipulation. They did not need to be thrust down by divine judgment. They had thrust themselves down by turning away from the fountain of life. And those who knew God, those who remained upright of heart, they were not necessarily those who never sinned or never doubted or never failed. They were those who continued to turn toward the light, who drank from the fountain even when they did not deserve it, who took refuge in the shadow of wings even when they felt unworthy of shelter. Righteousness was not perfection. It was orientation. It was knowing where the source lay and continuing to seek it again and again, despite every failure and every doubt. Tobias slept deeply that night, dreamlessly, like a child secure in his father's house. The third day dawned clear and bright, and Tobias woke with a sense of purpose. He knew he would leave the hermitage soon, but not yet. There was one more thing he needed to do. After his morning ablutions at the spring, he gathered materials from around the ruins: a flat stone that could serve as a writing surface, a sharp rock he could use as a stylus, charcoal from his fire. It was crude compared to the fine parchment and ink he used in his father's shop, but it would suffice. He spent the day writing on the stone, inscribing words that came not from any text he had copied, but from his own heart. They were a testimony, a record of what he had learned in this place, so that some future traveler, some future soul in need of hope, might read them and take comfort. The writing was slow and painstaking, the stone resistant to his makeshift stylus. But he persisted, pouring his whole experience into the words. When he finished, as the sun was beginning its afternoon descent, he read what he had written. In the year that Herod was king, in a time of great trouble and confusion, I came to this place empty and despairing. I had seen the wickedness of men and lost faith in the goodness of God. But here, in this wilderness, beside this spring that flows in defiance of all reason, I learned the truth. God's love is not measured by human virtue. It does not rise and fall with our worthiness. It is constant as these mountains, faithful as the stars, abundant as water from the deep. Take refuge here, traveler. Drink deeply. Know that you are loved with an everlasting love, not because you have earned it, but because that is who God is, the fountain of life, the river of delights, the shadow of wings beneath which all may find shelter. I came seeking answers to my doubt. I leave with something better, trust in the midst of mystery. May you find the same. He set the stone at the entrance to the cave where others would see it and felt a deep satisfaction. It was not great literature, not the kind of work that would be preserved in scrolls and studied by future generations. But it was true, and it was his, and perhaps it would help someone someday. The rest of the afternoon he spent in final preparation for his departure. He would leave at dawn the next day, following the path back toward Jerusalem. But this time he would not return the same man who had left. He cleaned the cave carefully, gathering the ashes from his fires and scattering them away from the spring. He offered a final prayer of gratitude for the shelter and the water and the solitude that had made transformation possible. As evening fell, he sat one last time at the edge of the spring and watched the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose. He thought about what awaited him in Jerusalem, the noise and crowds, the hypocrisy and wickedness he had fled. But now he understood that those things, real as they were not the deepest truth. The deepest truth was this water, these stars, these mountains. The deepest truth was the love that sustained all things, whether they acknowledged it or not. A sound made him turn, and he saw a figure approaching down the wadi. For a moment, his heart lifted, thinking it might be Matthias returning. But as the figure drew closer, he saw it was a different man, younger, perhaps 30 years old, with the weathered face of someone who spent his days outdoors. The man raised his hand in greeting, and Tobias returned the gesture. "Peace be upon you," the stranger said when he reached the spring. "I had hoped to find water here. My skin has been empty since noon." "Peace be upon you as well," Tobias replied. "Drink as much as you need. The spring is generous. The man knelt at the pool and drank with obvious relief, cupping water to his mouth again and again. When he had satisfied his thirst, he sat back and looked at Tobias with curious eyes. "You are far from civilization," he observed. "Are you one of the hermits who live in these places?" Tobias smiled. "No, only a visitor, though I suppose for a few days I have lived as a hermit does. I came seeking clarity, I suppose, understanding." "And did you find it?" the man asked. Tobias considered the question carefully. "I found something better than understanding," he said finally. "I found trust. I found that some questions do not need answers if one can learn to rest in the faithfulness of the one who holds all answers." The stranger nodded thoughtfully. "I, too, am seeking something," he said. "I am a shepherd, or I was until last month. My flock was struck by disease, and I lost nearly everything. My wife tells me I must trust in God's provision, but I confess I find it difficult when my children cry from hunger." Tobias felt a surge of compassion for this man whose troubles were so concrete and immediate. He reached into his pack and pulled out the bread the widow had given him, breaking it in half. "Here," he said, offering one half to the shepherd. "It is not much, but it is given freely." The shepherd's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. He took the bread with hands that trembled slightly. "You are generous to a stranger," he said. "May God bless you for it." "A widow gave it to me just yesterday," Tobias explained. "She had even less than I do, yet she shared without hesitation. She taught me that when we give what little we have, we discover that God has already given us more than enough." They ate together in companionable silence as the stars began to appear. Then, as they had both filled their waterskins for the night, the shepherd asked, "Will you tell me what brought you to this place? What questions drove you into the wilderness?" And so Tobias told him. He spoke of his work as a scribe, of witnessing hypocrisy among the religious leaders, of his crisis of faith. He spoke of the psalm that had guided him, of Matthias the hermit and his wisdom, of the days spent in silence beside this spring. He spoke of coming to understand that God's love was not contingent on human worthiness, that it flowed from the divine nature as water flowed from this spring, constant, abundant, freely offered to all. The shepherd listened with complete attention, and when Tobias finished, there were tears on his weathered cheeks. "You have given me more than bread," he said quietly. "You have given me hope. I thought God was punishing me for some hidden sin, that the loss of my flock was a judgment. But if what you say is true, if God's love is really that constant, that generous, then perhaps my troubles are not punishment, but simply the randomness of living in a broken world, and perhaps, even in the midst of loss, I can trust that I am not abandoned." They talked long into the night, two strangers who had become brothers through shared bread and shared truth. The shepherd spoke of his life, his family, his dreams for his children. Tobias spoke of his father, his craft, his hopes to return to Jerusalem with new eyes. When they finally lay down to sleep, each wrapped in his cloak beneath the stars, Tobias felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what life was meant to be. People encountering people, sharing the abundance they had received, pointing one another toward the fountain of life. In the morning, they woke together, washed together at the spring, and shared the remaining bread. Then the shepherd continued his journey eastward toward the Jordan, where he hoped to find work with other shepherds until he could rebuild his flock. And Tobias gathered his few belongings and began the walk back toward Jerusalem, back toward the life he had left, but would now inhabit differently. The journey back took 2 full days, and every step felt different from his journey out. The same landscape that had seemed harsh and hostile now appeared beautiful in its darkness. The same heat that had oppressed him now felt like a cleansing fire. He walked with a lighter step, pausing often to notice things he had missed before. The intricate patterns in the rock faces, the persistence of small plants growing in impossible cracks, the tracks of animals crisscrossing the path, evidence of the hidden life that survived even here. On the first night, he camped in the same small cave where he had spent his first night out of Jerusalem. But this time, he slept peacefully, untroubled by doubt or questions. He dreamed of water, endless water, a river flowing from a great height down through the mountains, gathering tributaries, growing wider and deeper until it reached the sea. And in the dream, he understood that he was meant to be one of those tributaries, not the source, not the sea, but one small stream that added its waters to the great flow of divine love moving through the world. On the second day, as he climbed back up from the Jordan Valley toward Jerusalem, he met other travelers, a family of pilgrims heading to the city for Passover, a merchant with a train of donkeys loaded with goods, a group of young men, students of the law, engaged in heated debate about some fine point of interpretation. Tobias greeted them all, and when the students asked his opinion on their debate, he smiled and said, "I am only a simple scribe, but I have learned that love is greater than knowledge, and trust is deeper than understanding. Perhaps your question matters less than the spirit in which you seek its answer." The students looked at him strangely, clearly finding his response unsatisfying, and continued their argument. But one of them, the youngest, hung back and walked beside Tobias for a while. "You have been to the wilderness," the young man said. It was not a question. "I can see it in your eyes. What did you find there?" "I found a spring," Tobias said simply, "water flowing in a place of thirst. And I learned that this is what God's love is like, constant, abundant, freely given. Everything else is commentary." As the walls of Jerusalem came into view, rising white and golden in the afternoon sun, Tobias felt his heart quicken. He thought of his father, wondering how Simeon would receive him. He thought of his work, the scrolls waiting to be copied. He thought of the people he would encounter, the hypocrites and the humble, the powerful and the poor. And he knew that he would see them all differently now, not with naive optimism that ignored their failures, but with a compassion rooted in the knowledge that they, like him, were seeking water in the desert. Some had found the spring. Others were still wandering. His job was not to judge, but to point the way, to share what he had received. He entered through the Damascus gate in the late afternoon, when the city was at its busiest. The sights and sounds that had once seemed chaotic now felt like a kind of symphony, each person playing their part, each life intersecting with others in patterns too complex to fully comprehend. He made his way through the familiar streets, past the market stalls and workshops, the beggars and the merchants, the children playing, and the old men sitting in doorways. He saw Ezra the blind at his usual spot near the temple, and this time Tobias stopped. He pressed several coins into the man's hand, far more than was customary, and said, "Peace be upon you, brother. May you know that you are beloved of God." Ezra's sightless eyes turned toward him, and his weathered face broke into a smile. "I know you," he said, though Tobias was certain they had never spoken before. "You are the young scribe, son of Simeon. Something has changed in you. I cannot see your face, but I can hear it in your voice." "I have been in the wilderness," Tobias said. "I have learned to see differently." "Then blessed be your journey," Ezra said, "and blessed be your return. Go in peace." Tobias continued through the city until he reached the small street where his father's shop stood. The door was open, and he could see Simeon inside, bent over a table, his hand moving steadily across a scroll. For a moment, Tobias simply stood and watched, his heart full of love for this man who had known exactly what he needed, who had loved him enough to send him away so he could find his way back. Then Simeon looked up, and their eyes met. The old man's face transformed with joy, and he rose from his work with an alacrity that belied his years. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and embraced his son, holding him tightly without words. Tobias felt his father's shoulders shake with silent tears, and his own eyes filled as well. They stood together in the doorway for a long moment, simply holding one another, while the life of Jerusalem flowed around them. Finally, Simeon pulled back and looked at his son's face, his own eyes bright with tears and laughter. "You have found what you were seeking," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes, Father," Tobias said, "and it was exactly where you told me it would be. Not in any specific place, but in opening myself to see what has always been there." Simeon nodded and drew him inside the shop, where everything was exactly as Tobias had left it. The tables and stools, the jars of ink, the shelves lined with scrolls, the smell of parchment and cedar wood. But Tobias himself was not the same. He looked at it all with new eyes, seeing not just a workspace, but a sacred calling, an opportunity to serve by preserving and sharing the words that pointed toward truth. That evening, they sat together over a simple meal that Simeon had prepared. As they ate, Tobias told his father everything: the journey through the wilderness, the encounter with Matthias, the days at the hermitage, the shepherd and the widow, the insights that had come like water from rock. Simeon listened with the same complete attention he brought to everything, occasionally asking a question, more often simply nodding with understanding. When Tobias finished, Simeon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then he said, "When I was your age, when I made the same journey, I learned something that I could never have taught you in words. I could only send you to discover it yourself. The truth we arrive at through our own experience becomes part of us in a way that no teaching can accomplish. You have learned that God's love is constant and abundant, not contingent on our worthiness. You know this now, not because I told you or because you read it in a psalm, but because you have tasted and seen. That knowledge will sustain you through everything that comes." "But Father," Tobias said, "I still do not understand why there is so much wickedness, why people who know the law can be so cruel, why the innocent suffer." The wilderness did not answer those questions. Simeon smiled, a gentle expression full of hard-won wisdom. "No, it did not, and it will not. Some questions have no answers." Simeon smiled, a gentle expression full of hard-won wisdom. "No, it did not, and it will not. Some questions have no answers in this life, my son. The mystery of suffering, the problem of evil existing alongside divine goodness, these are questions that have troubled the righteous since Job sat in ashes. But what you have learned is more important than answers. You have learned to trust in the midst of mystery. You have learned that God's faithfulness is not dependent on our understanding." Tobias nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. Outside, the sounds of evening Jerusalem drifted through the window. The call of vendors closing their stalls, the laughter of children finishing their play before dark, the distant chanting from the temple as the evening sacrifice was offered. It was the same city he had left, yet he heard it differently now, as if Each sound carried its own small testimony to the abundance of life. "What will you do now?" Simeon asked, his eyes studying his son's face with gentle curiosity. "I will return to my work," Tobias said, "but I will work differently. Each letter I copy will be a prayer. Each scroll will be an offering. And when I see men like Malchus, men who carry Scripture but seem to have no love, I will remember that I am seeing only part of their story. Perhaps they too are wandering in their own wilderness, seeking water they have not yet found." Simeon rose and placed both hands on his son's shoulders, a gesture of blessing. "Then you have learned well. The scribe who copies with love serves God more truly than the one who copies with perfect accuracy but a cold heart. Go now and rest. Tomorrow we will work together, and you will teach me what the wilderness taught you." That night, Tobias slept in his own bed for the first time in 2 weeks, and his sleep was deep and dreamless, the sleep of one who has come home not just to a place, but to himself. The dawn came gently through Tobias's window, and he woke without the heaviness that had oppressed him for so many months. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the waking city, and realized that the weight in his chest, that knot of anger and disillusionment, was simply gone, not resolved through argument or explanation, but dissolved through experience. The way morning mist disappears, not through force, but through the simple presence of the sun. He rose and went to the small basin in the corner of his room, washing his face and hands in the cool water. Even this simple act felt different. The water on his skin reminded him of the spring in the wilderness, that impossible gift bubbling up from the depths of the earth. Everything was gift, he thought. Everything. The very fact of being alive, of having hands to wash and water to wash them with, of having a father who loved him and work to do, and a city to live in. All of it was grace, freely given like water from a spring that never ran dry. He dressed carefully, putting on his working tunic, the simple garment of a scribe. The fabric was worn but clean, mended in several places by his father's careful stitching. He ran his fingers over one of the patches and felt a surge of affection for the old man who had raised him alone after his mother's death, who had taught him not just the craft of copying, but the dignity of work done well, the holiness of preserving words that pointed toward truth. Downstairs, he found his father already at work, bent over a scroll, his hand moving with the steady precision of decades of practice. The morning light fell across the parchment, and Tobias could see that Simeon was copying from the book of Isaiah. He watched for a moment, noting how his father's lips moved slightly as he worked, how he seemed to breathe the words as he wrote them. "Good morning, Father," Tobias said quietly, not wanting to startle the old man. Simeon looked up, his face brightening. "Good morning, my son. Come, sit. There is bread and cheese from our neighbor, and I have just made fresh tea." They ate together in companionable silence, and then Simeon gestured to the empty table beside his own. "I have prepared your workspace," he said. "We have a commission from Rabbi Hillel, a copy of the book of Psalms for his grandson's coming of age. I thought you might want to begin with Psalm 36. Tobias felt his throat tighten with emotion. His father, as always, understood without needing explanation. He moved to the table and found everything prepared: fresh parchment, newly mixed ink, sharpened quills, a lamp for close work, and beside them a reference scroll already open to Psalm 36. He sat down and took a moment to center himself, a practice he had learned in the wilderness. He let his breathing slow, let his mind settle. Then he dipped his quill in the ink and began to write. The first word was transgression. His hand formed the Hebrew letters with practiced ease, but now each stroke felt weighted with meaning. He thought of Malchus, of the hardness he had seen in men who should have been soft with compassion. Yes, transgression was real. It spoke to the wicked in the depths of their hearts. This was truth. But even as he wrote about wickedness, he found himself eager to reach the verses that followed, the ones that had transformed his understanding. He worked slowly, taking his time, refusing to rush despite the efficiency his training had instilled. This was not just work. This was testimony. Each letter was a small act of witness to what he had learned. When he reached the verse about God's love reaching to the heavens, he paused. He set down his quill and closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back in the wilderness, standing on that ridge at night, looking up at the stars. He remembered how vast they had seemed, how eternal, how faithful in their courses. And he had understood, in a way that went deeper than words, that God's love was like that, vast beyond measure, constant beyond imagining, there whether humans noticed it or not. He opened his eyes and continued writing, and now tears were sliding down his cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of wonder, of recognition. He was copying words that were thousands of years old, words that had been copied by countless scribes before him and would be copied by countless scribes after him. He was part of a great river of testimony, a flow of truth that had begun long before his birth and would continue long after his death. And that was enough. That was more than enough. "You write differently now," his father said quietly from the other table. Tobias looked up and smiled. "I write with a different heart, Father. Before, I wrote from duty. Now, I write from love." Simeon nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "That is the difference between a scribe and a sage, my son. A scribe copies words. A sage copies truth he has tasted. You are becoming a sage." They worked together throughout the morning. The only sounds the scratch of quills on parchment, the occasional rustle as they turned a reference scroll, the distant noises of the city going about its business. To anyone looking in from outside, it would have seemed like any other day in the shop of Simeon the scribe. But to Tobias, everything had changed. The work was the same, but he was different. And that made all the difference. 3 days after his return, Tobias went to the temple for morning prayers. It was his custom, one he had maintained even during his darkest doubts, going through the motions of devotion even when his heart felt dead. But this morning, as he walked through the streets of Jerusalem, everything seemed alive with significance. He noticed things he had walked past 1,000 times before. The way the early light fell on the limestone walls, turning them golden. The smell of bread baking in the public ovens. The sound of water in the channels that carried runoff from the Temple Mount. The faces of people he passed, each one carrying their own burdens and joys, their own questions and certainties. As he approached the temple, he saw a familiar figure at the gate, Ezra the blind. The same beggar Malchus had scorned, the same man whose humiliation had been the beginning of Tobias's crisis of faith. Ezra sat in his usual spot, his bowl before him, his sightless eyes turned toward the sound of passing feet. Tobias had given him coins 3 days ago, but now he felt compelled to do more. He approached and knelt beside the old man, a gesture that made several passers-by turn and stare. It was not customary for a young man of means to kneel beside a beggar to place himself on the same level. "Peace be upon you, Ezra," Tobias said softly. The blind man turned his head, his face lighting with recognition. "Ah, the young scribe, I know your voice. You spoke to me 3 days ago with such kindness. You said I was beloved of God. And you are, Tobias said. I know this now in a way I did not before. Ezra reached out, and Tobias took his hand. Feeling the roughness of the old man's palm, the calluses of a lifetime spent sitting on stone. Tell me, Ezra said, what has changed in you? Even without eyes, I can sense transformation. You carry yourself differently. Your voice has a different quality. And so Tobias told him. He spoke of the wilderness, of the spring, of the stars in the mountains, and the shepherd he had met. He spoke of learning that God's love was not earned, but given, not conditional, but constant. He spoke of realizing that suffering was not always punishment, that blindness did not mean God's disfavor, that the rain fell on the righteous and the wicked alike. And this was not indifference, but a kind of grace, the grace of a love so vast it could not be contained by human categories of deserving. Ezra listened without interrupting, his face mobile with emotion. When Tobias finished, the old man was weeping, tears sliding from beneath his closed eyelids. You have given me a gift greater than any coin, he said. For years I have sat here, and many have given me money out of duty or pity. Some have given nothing and scorned me, like that Pharisee you mentioned. And I confess I have wondered, why has God made me blind? What sin did I commit? Was I cursed from birth? But if what you say is true, if God's love is not a reward for righteousness, then perhaps my blindness is not a punishment either. Perhaps it is simply what is, and I can receive God's love in the midst of it, not after it is resolved. Yes, Tobias said, gripping the old man's hand more tightly. That is exactly it. The love is already there, already surrounding us, like the air we breathe. Our suffering does not separate us from it. Nothing can separate us from it. They sat together for a long moment, 2 men at the gate of the temple, one young and one old, one sighted and one blind, both learning to see in ways that had nothing to do with eyes. Around them, the city moved in its ceaseless rhythms. But in this small space, there was perfect stillness, perfect peace. Finally, Ezra spoke again, his voice stronger now. Will you pray with me, young scribe? Will you pray the words you have been copying? I would be honored, Tobias said. And there, in the dust beside the temple gate, with worshippers stepping around them, and the morning sacrifice sending its smoke toward heaven, Tobias recited Psalm 36. He spoke each word slowly, clearly, letting them fall like drops of water on parched ground. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in their hearts. There is no fear of God before their eyes. He continued through the verses about wickedness, and Ezra nodded, acknowledging the truth of human darkness. But then Tobias reached the turning point, the place where the psalm shifts from lament to praise. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Ezra's face transformed, his expression moving from sorrow to something like wonder. And when Tobias reached the final verses, both men spoke them together, Ezra joining in from memory, his voice cracked but sure. How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. When they finished, Ezra was smiling through his tears. In your light do we see light, he repeated. I have been blind for 30 years, but I am beginning to see more clearly than I ever did with eyes. Thank you, young scribe. Thank you for bringing the light. Tobias stayed with Ezra for another hour, and they spoke of many things: the old man's life before his blindness, his memories of his wife who had died long ago, his hopes that his children would remember him with kindness. And Tobias listened with the full attention he had learned in the wilderness, the kind of listening that honors the speaker, that recognizes every human story as sacred. When he finally rose to continue to the temple, Ezra blessed him with words that would stay with Tobias forever. May you always remember that God's love reaches to the heavens, even when we sit in the dust, especially when we sit in the dust. Word of Tobias's transformation spread quietly through the community, in the way such things do in a city where everyone knows everyone else's business. His father's friends noticed the change when they came to commission scrolls. The rabbi at the synagogue remarked on it when Tobias attended Sabbath services, and within a week, Rabbi Hillel himself appeared at the door of Simeon's shop. Hillel was a legend in Jerusalem, a teacher known for his wisdom and his patience, his ability to distill complex teachings into simple truths that even children could understand. He was old now, his beard white as snow, but his eyes were sharp and kind, and when he looked at Tobias, it was with an expression of recognition, as if he saw something that pleased him. "Young Tobias," he said after the customary greetings had been exchanged, "I have heard that you have returned from a journey and that you have brought back more than you carried out." Tobias bowed respectfully. "I went seeking answers, Rabbi, and found something better: trust in the midst of questions." Hillel smiled, a broad expression that transformed his ancient face. "Ah, that is wisdom indeed. Most men spend their lives seeking certainty, when what we need is trust. Tell me, how did you learn this?" And so Tobias told his story once more, becoming more comfortable with each telling, finding new ways to express what he had experienced. Hillel listened with complete attention, occasionally nodding, sometimes closing his eyes as if to better absorb the words. When Tobias finished, the old rabbi was quiet for a long moment. "This is teaching that needs to be shared," he said finally, "not just with adults who are often too set in their thinking to truly hear, but with children whose hearts are still soft, still open. Would you come to my school, Tobias? Would you tell the children your story and teach them the psalm that transformed you?" Tobias felt a flutter of nervousness. He was a scribe, not a teacher. He knew how to copy words, not how to speak them to a room full of restless young minds. But he thought of Ezra's blessing, of the shepherd he had met in the wilderness, of the widow who had given him bread from her poverty. Each of them had shared what they had, trusting that it would be enough. Could he do less? "I will come, Rabbi," he said, "though I fear I am not skilled in teaching." "The best teachers," Hillel said with a twinkle in his eye, "are those who have learned through experience, not just through study." Children can smell the difference between truth that has been lived and truth that has merely been memorized. Come tomorrow in the afternoon, when the heat of the day has passed and the children are restless. We will see if your story can capture their attention. The next afternoon, Tobias found himself standing in the courtyard of Hillel's school, facing 24 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12 years old. They sat on the ground in a semicircle, looking up at him with expressions that ranged from curious to skeptical to openly bored. Rabbi Hillel sat to the side, his presence a quiet reassurance. Tobias felt his mouth go dry. What had he been thinking, agreeing to this? These children wanted stories of great battles and miraculous signs, not the quiet tale of a scribe learning to see differently. But then he remembered the shepherd's words about the lake, giving fish whether he was righteous or wicked. And he understood that this too was not about his worthiness. He simply needed to offer what he had and trust that it would reach those who needed to hear it. "Children," he began, his voice uncertain at first but growing stronger, "I want to tell you about a journey I took. Not a long journey in terms of distance, only about 15 miles from Jerusalem. But in another way, it was the longest journey of my life." He saw a few of the older children exchange glances, unimpressed, but a small girl in the front, perhaps 7 years old, leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes intent on his face. "I went into the wilderness," Tobias continued, "because I was angry. I had seen people who knew all the right words, who could recite the Torah perfectly, but whose hearts seemed hard and cold. I had seen them be cruel to those who needed kindness, and I began to wonder if people who claim to follow God can be so mean, what does that say about God?" Now he had their attention. The older boys had stopped whispering to each other. A skinny child with tangled hair was nodding as if he had wondered the same thing. "So I walked into the desert," Tobias said, "where it was so hot I thought I might melt like butter in the sun, where there were rocks everywhere and no trees and no water, and I was thirsty, so thirsty that my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth and my lips cracked and bled." The children's eyes widened. Now this was getting interesting. "But then," Tobias said, lowering his voice so they had to lean in to hear, "I found a spring in the middle of all those rocks, in a place where nothing should be able to live. There was water bubbling up from deep under the ground, cold, sweet water, and I drank and drank until my belly was full and I felt alive again." "Was it magic water?" the small girl asked, her voice breathless. Tobias smiled. "In a way, yes, but not the kind of magic you're thinking of. It was magical because it was there at all, because it came from some deep place under the earth that never ran dry. And as I sat beside that spring, I understood something." He paused, letting the silence build. Even the most restless children were still now, waiting. "I understood that God's love is like that spring. It doesn't flow because we're good enough or smart enough or righteous enough. It flows because that's what it does. It's always there, bubbling up, offered freely to anyone who's thirsty. And that changes everything." A boy of perhaps 10 raised his hand. "But what about the mean people, the ones who were cruel?" "That's the thing," Tobias said, sitting down on the ground so he was at their level. "Those people were like travelers walking past the spring without seeing it. The water was there, but they didn't stop to drink. They were so busy thinking they had to earn God's love by following every rule perfectly that they missed the whole point. God's love is a gift, not a wage. It's free water in the desert, offered to everyone." He saw understanding dawn on several faces. The small girl was smiling now, as if he had told her a wonderful secret. "So when someone is mean to you," Tobias continued, "or when you see people doing wrong things even though they claim to follow God, remember the spring. Their behavior doesn't change the fact that God's love is still there, still flowing. They're just choosing not to drink from it. But you can. You can drink as much as you want, whenever you want, and there will always be more." "Can you teach us the psalm?" another child asked. "The one that taught you this?" And so Tobias taught them Psalm 36, breaking it down line by line, helping them understand each image. When he reached the verse about feasting on the abundance of God's house, he asked them what they thought it meant. "Is it about real food?" one boy asked. "Yes and no," Tobias said. "It's about the kind of fullness that comes from knowing you're loved. Have you ever had a day when something wonderful happened? Maybe your father praised you, or your mother hugged you tight, and you felt so happy you didn't even care if you were hungry? Several children nodded vigorously. That's the kind of feast the psalm is talking about. It's the feast of knowing that God loves you, not because you're perfect, but just because you're His child. By the time the lesson ended, the children were reciting parts of the psalm with him, their young voices rising in the courtyard. Rabbi Hillel was beaming, and as the children dispersed, he approached Tobias. "You have the gift," the old rabbi said, "not just the gift of teaching, but the gift of having been taught by experience. Those children will remember today. They will carry that image of the spring with them, and when they face their own doubts and questions, they will remember that God's love is always flowing, always available. You have planted seeds today that will bear fruit for years to come." Tobias felt humbled by the praise, but also filled with a quiet joy. This was what it meant to share the abundance he had received, not hoarding it, not keeping it as private knowledge, but pouring it out like water from a spring, trusting that wherever it flowed, it would bring life. 2 weeks after his return from the wilderness, Tobias was working in the shop when he heard a familiar voice at the door. His hand froze mid-stroke, the quill hovering above the parchment. It was Malchus, the Pharisee whose cruelty to Ezra had been the catalyst for Tobias's crisis of faith. "Simeon!" Malchus's voice called out, smooth and confident. "I have need of your services again. That scroll of Deuteronomy your son copied for me has been much admired, and I wish to commission another, the book of Leviticus this time." Tobias felt his chest tighten. His first instinct was anger, the same anger he had felt when he witnessed Malchus's contempt for the beggar. But then he remembered the spring, the stars, the mountains. He remembered that wickedness was real but was not the deepest truth. He took a slow breath, set down his quill, and rose to greet the man who had once represented everything wrong with religious practice. Simeon was already speaking with Malchus, discussing the details of the commission. Tobias emerged from the back room and bowed respectfully. "Peace be upon you, Rabbi Malchus." Malchus turned, his eyes sharp and assessing. He was a man of perhaps 50, well dressed in the finest wool, his phylacteries prominent on his forehead and arm. Everything about him spoke of status and learning, of confidence in his own righteousness. "Ah, young Tobias," Malchus said, "I trust your work will be as exemplary this time as it was before. I have exacting standards, as you know." "I do know, Rabbi," Tobias said calmly, "and I will give the commission my best attention." They discussed the specifications, the quality of parchment, the size of the letters, the deadline. Throughout the conversation, Tobias observed Malchus with new eyes. He saw the same pride, the same self-satisfaction he had seen before. But now he also saw something else, a kind of hollowness, a hunger that no amount of learning or status could fill. Malchus was a man who had devoted his life to knowing every letter of the law, but had somehow missed its spirit. He was walking past the spring without seeing it. After Malchus left, Simeon looked at his son with concern. "I saw your face when he arrived. That is the man you told me about, isn't it? The one who was cruel to the beggar?" "Yes, father," Tobias said. "That is Malchus. And can you work for him? Can you create a scroll for a man whose behavior troubles you so deeply?" Tobias considered the question carefully. 2 months ago, he would have refused, would have seen it as a compromise, a collaboration with hypocrisy. But now he understood differently. "Yes," he said finally, "I can work for him, not because I approve of his behavior, but because the words I will copy are not mine or his. They are God's." Leviticus teaches about holiness, about purity, about the sacrifices that atone for sin. Perhaps If I copy those words with love, with an awareness of what they truly mean, some of that love will seep into the parchment. And perhaps when Malchus reads them, really reads them, not just with his eyes, but with his heart, something might shift in him. Simeon smiled, his eyes bright with approval. You have become wise, my son. You see that even in serving one who is flawed, we serve the truth itself. And who knows? You may be the instrument of Malchus's transformation, even if you never see it. Over the following weeks, Tobias worked on the scroll of Leviticus. It was challenging work. The book was long and detailed, filled with instructions about sacrifices and purity laws that could seem tedious to copy. But Tobias approached each section as an opportunity for meditation. When he copied the instructions about the sin offering, he thought about how all people, even Pharisees like Malchus, even scribes like himself, needed atonement. No one was exempt from the need for grace. When he copied the laws about caring for the poor and the stranger, he thought of Ezra sitting at the temple gate, and he prayed that these words might someday touch Malchus's heart and teach him compassion. When he copied the command to love your neighbor as yourself, he paused for a long time. This was the heart of it all, the summary of everything the law was meant to teach. And Malchus knew this verse, could probably recite the entire chapter from memory, but knowing and living were two different things. One afternoon, as Tobias was working on a particularly intricate section, he heard a commotion outside. He set down his quill and went to the door and saw a crowd gathering in the street. In the center of the crowd was Malchus, and he was engaged in a heated argument with another Pharisee, this one younger and less well-dressed. You interpret the law too loosely, Malchus was saying, his voice loud and angry. You would have us abandon the traditions of our fathers, the careful observances that keep us pure and separate from the nations around us. The younger Pharisee responded with equal heat. And you interpret it so strictly that you have made it a burden impossible to bear. The law was given as a gift to show us how to live, not to crush us under the weight of endless regulations. Tobias watched, and he saw how the crowd was divided, some nodding in agreement with Malchus, others supporting the younger teacher. And he understood that this was an ancient argument, one that had been going on since the law was first given, one that would continue long after he was dead. There would always be those who emphasized the letter over the spirit and those who emphasized the spirit over the letter. Both sides contained some truth, and both sides could fall into error. But as he watched Malchus's face, red with anger and certainty, absolutely convinced of his own rightness, Tobias felt not anger, but a deep sadness. This man had devoted his entire life to the study of God's Word, yet he had somehow missed the central message. He was like someone who studied every detail of a map, but never took the journey. He knew about the spring, but had never tasted its water. That evening, after the crowd had dispersed and Malchus had stalked away in righteous indignation, Tobias returned to his work on the Leviticus scroll. He had reached chapter 19, and as he copied verse 18, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," he found himself praying. "Father in heaven," he whispered, "give Malchus eyes to see what he has been blind to. Help him understand that all these laws, all these regulations are meant to point toward love. They are not the destination, but the path. They are not the water, but signs pointing toward the spring. Let the words I am copying be more than ink on parchment. Let them be seeds that might someday sprout in his heart." He didn't know if his prayer would be answered. He might never know. Malchus might continue in his self-righteousness until his dying day, might never experience the transformation that comes from drinking deeply from the fountain of divine love. But that was not Tobias's responsibility. His responsibility was simply to do his work with love, to copy these words with reverence and care, and to trust that God could use even imperfect vessels, both Malchus and himself, to accomplish his purposes. As word of Tobias's transformation continued to spread through Jerusalem, something unexpected began to happen. People started coming to Simeon's shop, not just to commission scrolls, but to talk. They came in the early morning before the heat of the day, or in the evening as the sun was setting, and they asked Tobias to tell them about his journey. At first, he was uncomfortable with the attention. He was a scribe, not a rabbi or a teacher. Who was he to instruct others? But his father reminded him of what Rabbi Hillel had said, that the best teaching comes not from those who have merely studied, but from those who have lived what they teach. And so gradually, a pattern developed. Several evenings a week, after the day's work was done, Tobias would sit in the courtyard behind the shop, and whoever wanted to come would gather to listen. Some nights, there were only 2 or 3 people. Other nights, the courtyard was full, with people sitting on the ground, standing against the walls, even perching on the low roof that covered one corner. They were an unlikely assembly: wealthy merchants and poor laborers, learned scribes and illiterate servants, old women who had seen 7 decades of life, and young men just beginning their journeys. What brought them together was a common thirst, a sense that there was something more than what their daily lives and even their religious observances were giving them. One evening, about a month after Tobias's return, a particularly large group had gathered. The air was cool, the sky deepening from blue to purple as the first stars appeared. Someone had brought a lamp, and its gentle light created a circle of warmth in the gathering darkness. "Tell us again about the spring," a woman said. Her name was Judith, a widow who sold vegetables in the market. "I need to hear it tonight. My son is ill, and I am afraid." Tobias had learned that people often needed to hear the same stories multiple times, especially when they were facing difficult circumstances. Truth had to be absorbed gradually, like water seeping into parched ground. The spring was in a place where nothing should have been able to live, he began, his voice quiet so that people had to lean in to hear. "I was walking through the wilderness east of Jerusalem, through the Judean desert where the sun beats down without mercy and the rocks hold the heat long into the night. I had been walking for 2 days, and my water was nearly gone. My throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. My lips were cracked and bleeding, and I was beginning to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake, if I would die out there in that emptiness." He paused, letting them feel the weight of that fear. Several people nodded. They knew what it was to be afraid, to wonder if they had made wrong choices, to feel vulnerable and alone. "But then," Tobias continued, "I came around a bend in the wadi, and there it was, water, clear, cold water, bubbling up from deep in the earth, forming a small pool before trickling away into the sand. And I fell to my knees beside that pool, and I drank. I drank until I thought I would burst, until the water was running down my chin and soaking my tunic, and it was the best thing I had ever tasted. But it wasn't just water," a young man said. He had been coming for several weeks now, and Tobias had learned his name was Joash, that he was a carpenter struggling with doubt. "Was it?" "No," Tobias agreed. "Or rather, yes, it was water. Real physical water that saved my life. But as I sat beside that spring, I began to understand that it was also a picture of something else. That spring didn't flow because I deserved it or because I had been righteous. It didn't ask me to prove myself worthy before it would quench my thirst. It simply flowed freely and abundantly because that was its nature. And I realized that God's love is like that. But what about when we sin? Another voice asked from the back. Tobias couldn't see who had spoken. What about when we fail and fall short? Doesn't that separate us from God's love? This was a question that came up often in various forms. People had been taught that God's favor was conditional, that it depended on their obedience, their righteousness, their careful observance of every commandment. The idea that love could be freely given, not earned, was both wonderful and terrifying. Think about the spring, Tobias said. If I had walked past it without stopping, if I had been too proud or too foolish to drink, the water would have kept flowing. My refusal wouldn't have dried up the spring. It would just have meant I remained thirsty. Our sin doesn't stop God from loving us. It stops us from receiving that love. It's like closing our mouths when someone offers us water. The problem isn't that the water isn't there. The problem is that we're refusing to drink. Judith, the widow, spoke up again. But what about when our circumstances don't change? When we drink from the spring, as you say, but the illness doesn't heal, the poverty doesn't lift, the loss remains a loss? How do we hold on to this truth when life continues to be hard? Her voice trembled slightly, and Tobias could hear the weight of genuine struggle behind her words. This was not a theoretical question. This was a woman who had buried her husband, who watched her children go to bed hungry, who had every reason to wonder if God's love was real. Tobias was quiet for a long moment, and in the silence he heard the sounds of Jerusalem settling into night. Distant voices, a dog barking, the whisper of wind through the narrow streets. Then he spoke, choosing his words carefully. The spring in the wilderness, he said slowly, did not change the desert. The rocks were still rocks. The heat was still unbearable. The journey was still difficult. But the spring made it possible to continue. It gave me what I needed to take the next step, and then the next, and then the next. God's love doesn't always remove our circumstances, Judith. Sometimes it gives us the strength to endure them. Sometimes it gives us peace in the midst of them. And sometimes, he paused, his voice catching slightly, sometimes it transforms how we see them, so that even suffering becomes a place where we can know we are not abandoned. Judith nodded slowly, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. My husband used to say something similar, she whispered. He would say, God's presence is the gift, not the absence of trouble. I am only now beginning to understand what he meant. An older man spoke up from the back of the courtyard. I have been coming here for 3 weeks now, listening to your story and your teaching. And I must tell you, I am a Pharisee, like Malchus. I have spent my life studying the law, teaching others to follow it precisely. But hearing you speak, I realize I have been like a man standing beside the spring, telling everyone about water, describing its properties, teaching the proper way to drink, but never actually drinking myself. The courtyard fell silent. Tobias recognized the man now. His name was Nicodemus, a respected teacher, a member of the Sanhedrin. For him to speak this way, to acknowledge such a thing publicly, was remarkable. What do I do now? Nicodemus asked, and his voice held a vulnerability that seemed almost painful for a man of his stature. How do I drink after all these years of merely talking about water? Tobias rose and moved toward the older man, and the crowd parted to let him pass. When he reached Nicodemus, he placed his hand gently on the Pharisee's shoulder. You have already begun, Tobias said softly. The moment you recognized your thirst, The moment you acknowledge that all your knowledge was not enough, that was the first drink. Now you simply continue. You come back to the spring again and again. You let the water transform you from the inside out. And you remember that God's love has been there all along, waiting for you to stop explaining it and start experiencing it. Nicodemus nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, young scribe. Thank you for showing this old teacher that there is still much to learn. As the gathering began to disperse, people rising slowly, reluctant to break the spell of peace that had settled over the courtyard, Tobias felt his father's hand on his shoulder. Simeon said nothing, but the pride and love in his eyes spoke volumes. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Tobias sat alone in the courtyard under the stars. The same stars that had shone over the wilderness spring, the same stars that had guided Abraham and Moses and David. He thought about all that had happened since his return from the wilderness, the scroll he was copying from Malchus, the children he had taught, the evening gatherings, the transformations he was witnessing. He thought about Ezra the blind, whose face now showed a peace that had nothing to do with physical sight. He thought about the shepherd he had met at the spring, who had taken his small gift of bread and turned it into hope. He thought about Judith the widow, still struggling but no longer drowning in despair. He thought about Nicodemus, a man of immense learning, finally willing to acknowledge that knowledge alone was not enough. And he understood that this was his calling now, not just to copy scrolls, though he would continue that sacred work, but to be a living testimony to what he had learned in the wilderness, to point others toward the spring, to remind them that God's love reached to the heavens and extended to the clouds, that it was like the mighty mountains and the great deep, vast beyond measure, constant beyond imagining, freely offered to all who would drink. He pulled out his personal copy of Psalm 36 and read it one more time by the light of his lamp. But when he reached the final verse, he added his own prayer, speaking quietly into the night. Continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. And may I never forget, O Lord, that your love is the deepest truth, deeper than human wickedness, stronger than doubt, more constant than the stars. May I drink from your spring every day of my life, and may I help others find their way to those living waters. For you are the fountain of life, and in your light we see light. As he finished his prayer, a profound peace settled over him. Not the peace of having all questions answered, but the peace of knowing that he was held by a love that would never let him go. A love that had been there in his darkest doubts, that had guided him into the wilderness, that had spoken to him through springs and stars and strangers. A love that would continue to flow like water from deep beneath the earth for all eternity. He looked up at the stars one last time, then slowly rose and climbed the stairs to his room. Tomorrow would bring new work, new opportunities to serve, new chances to share what he had received. But tonight he would rest in the shadow of divine wings, secure in the knowledge that he was beloved. And in the morning, when he woke to continue his work on the scroll of Leviticus for Malchus, he would copy each letter as an act of love, not for the Pharisee who would receive it, but for the God whose words he was preserving, and for all the future readers who might, like him, find their way from knowledge to trust, from law to love, from thirst to living water. The lamp flickered and went out, and Tobias fell asleep with the words of the psalm on his lips. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. And somewhere in the eternal now, beyond time and space, that fountain continued to flow, offering its water freely to all who would come and drink.